Chapter 12. The Letter of Wrath. It was a still September afternoon. No wind stirred in the hanging woods that were dark all about the ancient house of Ffynnon. The only sound in the dim air was the lowing of the cattle. They had wandered, it seemed, from the fields, and had come in by the gate of the farmyard, and stood there melancholy, as if they mourned for their dead master. And the horses, 4 great, heavy, patient-looking beasts, they were there too. And in the lower field the sheep were standing, as if they waited to be fed. "You would think they all knew there was something wrong," one of the soldiers muttered to another. A pale sun showed for a moment and glittered on their bayonets. They were standing about the body of poor dead Griffith, with a certain grimness growing on their faces and hardening there. Their corporal snapped something at them again. They were quite ready. Lewis knelt down by the dead man and looked closely at the great gaping wound in his side. "He's been dead a long time," he said. "A week, 2 weeks perhaps. He was killed by some sharp-pointed weapon. How about the family? How many are there of them? I never attended to them." "There was Griffith and his wife, and his son Thomas, and Mary Griffith, his daughter. And I do think there was a gentleman lodging with them this summer." That was from one of the farmers. They all looked at one another, this party of rescue, who knew nothing of the danger that had smitten this house of quiet people, nothing of the peril which had brought them to this pass of a farmyard with a dead man in it, and his beasts standing patiently about him, as if they waited for the farmer to rise up and give them their food. Then the party turned to the house. It was an old 16th-century building, with the singular round Flemish chimney that is characteristic of Machen. The walls were snowy with whitewash, the windows were deeply set and stone mullioned, and a solid stone-tiled porch sheltered the doorway from any winds that might penetrate to the hollow of that hidden valley. The windows were shut tight. There was no sign of any life or movement about the place. The party of men looked at one another, and then the churchwarden amongst the farmers. The sergeant of police, Lewis, and the corporal drew together. "What is it to goodness, doctor?" said the churchwarden. "I can tell you nothing at all, except that that poor man there has been pierced to the heart," said Lewis. "Do you think they are inside, and they will shoot us?" said another farmer. He had no notion of what he meant by they, and no one of them knew better than he. They did not know what the danger was, or where it might strike them, or whether it was from without or from within. They stared at the murdered man, and gazed dismally at one another. "Come," said Lewis, "we must do something. We must get into the house and see what is wrong." "Yes, but suppose they are at us while we are getting in," said the sergeant. "Where shall we be then, Dr. Lewis?" The corporal put one of his men by the gate at the top of the farmyard, another at the gate by the bottom of the farmyard, and told them to challenge and shoot. The doctor and the rest opened the little gate of the front garden and went up to the porch and stood listening by the door. It was all dead silence. Lewis took an ash stick from one of the farmers and beat heavily 3 times on the old black oaken door, studded with antique nails. He struck 3 thundering blows, and then they all waited. There was no answer from within. He beat again, and still silence. He shouted to the people within, but there was no answer. They all turned and looked at one another, that party of quest and rescue, who knew not what they sought, what enemy they were to encounter. There was an iron ring on the door. Lewis turned it, but the door stood fast. It was evidently barred and bolted. The sergeant of police called out to open, but again there was no answer. They consulted together. There was nothing for it but to blow the door open, and some one of them called in a loud voice to anybody that might be within to stand away from the door, or they would be killed. And at this very moment The yellow sheepdog came bounding up the yard from the woods and licked their hands and fawned on them and barked joyfully. "Indeed now," said one of the farmers, "he did know that there was something amiss. A pity it was, Thomas Williams, that we did not follow him when he implored us last Sunday." The corporal motioned the rest of the party back, and they stood looking fearfully about them at the entrance to the porch. The corporal disengaged his bayonet and shot into the keyhole, calling out once more before he fired. He shot and shot again. So heavy and firm was the ancient door, so stout its bolts and fastenings. At last he had to fire at the massive hinges, and then they all pushed together, and the door lurched open and fell forward. The corporal raised his left hand and stepped back a few paces. He hailed his 2 men at the top and bottom of the farmyard. They were all right, they said, and so the party climbed and struggled over the fallen door into the passage, and into the kitchen of the farmhouse. Young Griffith was lying dead before the hearth, before a dead fire of white wood ashes. They went on towards the parlor, and in the doorway of the room was the body of the artist, Secretan, as if he had fallen in trying to get to the kitchen. Upstairs, the 2 women, Mrs. Griffith and her daughter, a girl of 18, were lying together on the bed in the big room, clasped in each other's arms. They went about the house, searched the pantries, the back kitchen, and the cellars. There was no life in it. "Look," said Dr. Lewis, when they had come back to the big kitchen. "Look, it is as if they had been besieged. Do you see that piece of bacon half gnawed through?" Then they found these pieces of bacon, cut from the sides on the kitchen wall, here and there about the house. There was no bread in the place, no milk, no water. "And," said one of the farmers, "they had the best water here in all Marion. The well is down there in the wood. It is most famous water. The old people did used to call it Ffynnon Teilo. It was Saint Teilo's well, they did say." "They must have died of thirst," said Lewis. "They have been dead for days and days." The group of men stood in the big kitchen and stared at one another, a dreadful perplexity in their eyes. The dead were all about them, within the house and without it, and it was in vain to ask why they had died thus. The old man had been killed with the piercing thrust of some sharp weapon. The rest had perished, it seemed probable, of thirst. But what possible enemy was this that besieged the farm and shut in its inhabitants? There was no answer. The sergeant of police spoke of getting a cart and taking the bodies into Porth, and Dr. Lewis went into the parlor that Secretan had used as a sitting room, intending to gather any possessions or effects of the dead artist that he might find there. Half a dozen portfolios were piled up in one corner. There were some books on a side table, a fishing rod and basket behind the door. That seemed all. No doubt there would be clothes and such matters upstairs, and Lewis was about to rejoin the rest of the party in the kitchen when he looked down at some scattered papers lying with the books on the side table. On one of the sheets he read to his astonishment the words, "Dr. James Lewis, Porth." This was written in a staggering, trembling scrawl, and examining the other leaves, he saw that they were covered with writing. The table stood in a dark corner of the room, and Lewis gathered up the sheets of paper and took them to the window ledge and began to read, amazed at certain phrases that had caught his eye. But the manuscript was in disorder, as if the dead man who had written it had not been equal to the task of gathering the leaves into their proper sequence. It was some time before the doctor had each page in its place. This was the statement that he read, with ever-growing wonder, while a couple of the farmers were harnessing one of the horses in the yard to a cart, and the others were bringing down the dead women. "I do not think that I can last much longer. We shared out the last drops of water a long time ago. I do not know how many days ago. We fall asleep and dream and walk about the house in our dreams, and I am often not sure whether I am awake or still dreaming. and so the days and nights are confused in my mind. I awoke not long ago, at least I suppose I awoke, and found I was lying in the passage. I had a confused feeling that I had had an awful dream which seemed horribly real, and I thought for a moment what a relief it was to know that it wasn't true, whatever it might have been. I made up my mind to have a good long walk to freshen myself up, and then I looked round and found that I had been lying on the stones of the passage, and it all came back to me. There was no walk for me. I have not seen Mrs. Griffith or her daughter for a long while. They said they were going upstairs to have a rest. I heard them moving about the room at first. Now I can hear nothing. Young Griffith is lying in the kitchen before the hearth. He was talking to himself about the harvest and the weather when I last went into the kitchen. He didn't seem to know I was there, as he went gabbling on in a low voice, very fast, and then he began to call the dog Tiger. There seems no hope for any of us. We are in the dream of death. Here the manuscript became unintelligible for half a dozen lines. Secretan had written the words dream of death 3 or 4 times over. He had begun a fresh word and had scratched it out, and then followed strange, unmeaning characters, the script, as Lewis thought, of a terrible language. And then the writing became clearer than it was at the beginning of the manuscript, and the sentences flowed more easily, as if the cloud on Secretan's mind had lifted for a while. There was a fresh start, as it were, and the writer began again in ordinary letter form. Dear Lewis, I hope you will excuse all this confusion and wandering. I intended to begin a proper letter to you, and now I find all that stuff that you have been reading, if this ever gets into your hands. I have not the energy even to tear it up. If you read it, you will know to what a sad pass I had come when it was written. It looks like delirium or a bad dream, and even now, though my mind seems to have cleared up a good deal, I have to hold myself in tightly to be sure that the experiences of the last days in this awful place are true, real things, not a long nightmare from which I shall wake up presently and find myself in my rooms at Chelsea. I have said of what I am writing, if it ever gets into your hands, and I am not at all sure that it ever will. If what is happening here is happening everywhere else, then I suppose the world is coming to an end. I cannot understand it. Even now I can hardly believe it. I know that I dream such wild dreams and walk in such mad fancies that I have to look out and look about me to make sure that I am not still dreaming. Do you remember that talk we had about 2 months ago when I dined with you? We got on, somehow or other, to space and time, and I think we agreed that as soon as one tried to reason about space and time, one was landed in a maze of contradictions. You said something to the effect that it was very curious, but this was just like a dream. A man will sometimes wake himself from his crazy dream, you said, by realizing that he is thinking nonsense. And we both wondered whether these contradictions that one can't avoid if one begins to think of time and space may not really be proofs that the whole of life is a dream, and the moon and the stars bits of nightmare. I have often thought over that lately. I kick at the walls, as Dr. Johnson kicked at the stone, to make sure that the things about me are there. And then that other question gets into my mind. Is the world really coming to an end, the world as we have always known it? And what on earth will this new world be like? I can't imagine it. It's a story like Noah's Ark and the flood. People used to talk about the end of the world and fire, but no one ever thought of anything like this. And then there's another thing that bothers me. Now and then I wonder whether we are not all mad together in this house. In spite of what I see and know, or perhaps I should say, because what I see and know is so impossible, I wonder whether we are not all suffering from a delusion. Perhaps we are our own jailers, and we are really free to go out and live. Perhaps what we think we see is not there at all. I believe I have heard of whole families going mad together, and I may have come under the influence of the house, having lived in it for the last 4 months. I know there are people who have been kept alive by their keepers forcing food down their throats, because they are quite sure that their throats are closed, so that they feel they are unable to swallow a morsel. I wonder now and then whether we are all like this in Ffynnon, yet in my heart I feel sure that it is not so. Still, I do not want to leave a madman's letter behind me, and so I will not tell you the full story of what I have seen, or believe I have seen. If I am a sane man, you will be able to fill in the blanks for yourself from your own knowledge. If I am mad, burn the letter and say nothing about it. Or perhaps, and indeed I am not quite sure, I may wake up and hear Mary Griffith calling to me in her cheerful sing-song that breakfast will be ready directly in a minute, and I shall enjoy it and walk over to Porth and tell you the queerest, most horrible dream that a man ever had, and ask what I had better take. I think that it was on a Tuesday that we first noticed that there was something queer about, only at the time we didn't know that there was anything really queer in what we noticed. I had been out since 9 o'clock in the morning trying to paint the marsh, and I found it a very tough job. I came home about 5 or 6 o'clock and found the family at Ffynnon laughing at old Tiger, the sheepdog. He was making short runs from the farmyard to the door of the house, barking with quick, short yelps. Mrs. Griffith and Miss Griffith were standing by the porch, and the dog would go to them, look in their faces, and then run up the farmyard to the gate, and then look back with that eager yelping bark, as if he were waiting for the women to follow him. Then, again and again, he ran up to them and tugged at their skirts, as if he would pull them by main force away from the house. Then the men came home from the fields, and he repeated this performance. The dog was running all up and down the farmyard, in and out of the barn and sheds, yelping, barking, and always with that eager run to the person he addressed, and running away directly, and looking back as if to see whether we were following him. When the house door was shut, and they all sat down to supper, he would give them no peace, till at last they turned him out of doors. And then he sat in the porch and scratched at the door with his claws, barking all the while. When the daughter brought in my meal, she said, "We can't think what is to come to old Tiger, and indeed he has always been a good dog too." The dog barked and yelped and whined and scratched at the door all through the evening. They let him in once, but he seemed to become quite frantic. He ran up to one member of the family after another. His eyes were bloodshot, and his mouth was foaming, and he tore at their clothes till they drove him out again into the darkness. Then he broke into a long, lamentable howl of anguish, and we heard no more of him.